All right, welcome to our 1-hour webinar. My name is Charlie Cicchetti with Green Building Education Services, gbes.com. We've partnered with MasterSpec to deliver this today, and we also have another special guest who really is a materials guru. Jana and Michael have joined me. We're going to go through some introductions in a minute. But our goal today is to really have a conversation around a lot of the changes with LEED version 4. A lot of you manufacturers out there, some of your companies are out in front, but maybe you're being asked on some LEED projects for certain documentation. You're not even sure where to get it internally or get it online from some databases, or there's some others that we know are with us today that are newer to this. Maybe you're working on quite a bit of LEED version 3 or LEED 2009 projects, and you haven't been asked for this yet. So we hope you get a lot out of today. We want it to be conversational. We've got some information to present, but we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. Again, my name is Charlie, and we're going to go ahead and dive in here. My background is commercial construction. I got out of school at Georgia Tech, worked in construction, then real estate, then green buildings, and I've been a big part of the green building movement for a number of years. I'm a big fan of education, so we really help people pass LEED exams, now the new WELL exams. I'm proud to be a WELL AP and WELL faculty, and we also help people with continuing education with seminars like this webinar today. So if any of you are LEED professionals, you can log 1 hour of LEED credit there to help maintain your credentials. So I'll be presenting a little bit of information about LEED and the new requirements, and I'll be kind of moderating our talk today. I'm joined by a friend of mine, Jana, out of New York City. She works with Delos Solutions. Jana is just, a materials guru. That's some of her background before she got on all these exciting WELL projects, and she's really going to help us demystify the difference between EPDs, HPDs, what's cradle to cradle, what's the declare label if we get into that talk. So, Jana, can you tell the audience a little more about you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charlie. So as Charlie mentioned, my name is Jana, and I work at Delos Solutions. For those of you who aren't familiar with Delos, we are the organization that pioneered the WELL building standard, and now with the International WELL Building Institute really holding and administering the standard, we now have push past just WELL certification and do all things health and wellness within buildings. So on the Delos Solutions team, I am a consultant that helps project teams with WELL certification and then also more generally integrating wellness strategies into the built environment. I'm also our materials specialist, so spend a lot of my time doing a deep dive not only on the WELL features, but all things material related as far as what we're bringing into our spaces from furniture and furnishings to what we're building our buildings with, thinking more on the building product side. I'm also working on a great project right now, our new Delos headquarters based in New York City, right around the corner from our current office. And we are pursuing WELL Platinum certification, LEED V4 Platinum certification, and Living Building Challenge Pedal certification, focused on materials. So that's been a great side project that has really allowed me to dive into some of the overlaps between all of these building standards and the requirements with each. So excited to join today and share some more insight on EPDs and HPDs specifically.
Thanks, Jana. Yeah, no, that's going to be such a cool office, and we're going to get to it today in our webinar, but, of course, LEED is really pushing harder on us as specifiers, on construction companies, on manufacturers, that we have to be more transparent with our materials. But, Jana, you mentioned WELL. WELL is really pushing, and, of course, Living Building Challenge. So there are these rating systems, these green building rating systems, that are forcing us to use better materials and be more transparent. So this is going to be great. Also joined by Michael. Michael's with MasterSpec and ARCOM. Michael's a professional engineer based in Washington, D.C., and he's the director of content production. So he is over all of these industry-leading specs for LEED V4 with WELL and staying out in front. Michael, can you tell the audience a little more about you?
Hey, thank you, Charlie, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, as Charlie mentioned, I'm a professional engineer, worked in engineering consulting for about 10 or 12 years, and then decided I wanted to try something a little different, and that's when I ended up writing specifications for MasterSpec, and now I'm running one of the major groups here. Thanks, Charlie, for putting this all together, and I also wanted to mention, you mentioned WELL. Some of what we're going to talk about today, too, is also usable when you're talking about ASHRAE 189.1 or the International Green Construction Code, or IGCC. So there's a lot of applicability for what we're talking about across a couple different sustainable design rating systems.
Awesome. All right, Michael, thanks very much. This is going to be great. Throughout the course today, we're going to throw out a few polls. If you would, some housekeeping items, just answer those polls, and I'll report back on some data. And if you have any questions, on the right side there, there's a chat box. We're going to have a good Q&A later in the presentation. So our agenda here for our 1 hour session is we've got our introductions out of the way. We've got some subject matter experts today. I'm going to take you through some of the LEED credit language. And then we're going to get into some key terminology, EPDs, HPDs, cradle to cradle. Jen is going to take us through just, who's using this and even some early adopters, which manufacturers are out in front. And then we're going to look at some specifications. And the team at Master Spec's already out to help everyone here. And we also have some resources. Some of you are like, okay, I get it. This is going to affect my business. I need to start on these EPDs. Where do I start? There's a lot of great online resources we're going to give you links to. Our learning objectives, again, this is going to be 1 hour of LEED continuing education. Let's make sure you understand the new LEED version 4 requirements in the materials and resources section. It's no longer just about recycled content and buying materials from within 500 miles. We really got to go and take a look at what are we doing to green up the process, what's really in these materials. We want you to become familiar with this terminology, and we also want to make sure who are the early adopters, where are the resources out there, so I too can handle this on my next project. So LEED version 4, at the time of this recording, there's 2,000 projects registered for LEED version 4 and 200 buildings that have been certified. But here's the thing, you can no longer register for a LEED V3 or a LEED 2009 project. So any new LEED project in the hopper, you're going to have to follow these more stringent standards. We had LEED version 3, LEED 2009 for quite some time. The U.S. Green Building Council was going to make changes around 2012. They didn't. The industry said, hey, that's too much too soon. So it took a few more years. And one of the biggest pushbacks with LEED version 4 was from the materials industry. But a lot of these credits we're going to show you are still optional, 1 or 2 points each, but now they're weighted a little more. And the requirements, let's just get everybody comfortable with them because LEED V4, LEED version 4 is upon us. The shift from 2009 to LEED version 4, now we do have some different product type rating systems. We're going to focus today's talk on if you're going to build that next new construction LEED building or one of the other green building standards, think new construction, major renovation, or maybe even an interiors build out. That's going to cover over 90%. But just for your information, there's BD plus C. When you see that, that means building, design, and construction. LEED for new construction fits in to that bucket. This is a LEED version 4 zoomed in on the scorecard. You can see there's a couple of requirements, prerequisites. You have to do those, and then we get into all of our optional points. Now, I know how it works. I've been in construction. I've been on the owner side, and now I'm on the LEED consulting and the education side. We're pushing on general contractors to make these points magically happen, and you got to be prepared. So now take a look. We can get 1 or 2 points for environmental product declarations, 1 or 2 points for sourcing of raw materials, and 1 or 2 points for material ingredients. Those are the 6 LEED points that all of you on this webinar today can directly affect, and that's what we're going to do a deeper dive on. So just understand LEED version 4, those are optional, but most architects, most owners, they're going to be leaning on the general contractor, the subcontractors, the vendors and manufacturers. Hey, we're used to LEED version 3 getting these points. Pretty easy, right? Regional materials within 500 miles, recycled materials. People have gotten used to those are pretty easy to get. That cut sheet, that MSDS sheet, we're used to it. Well, now LEED version 4, it's here, and you're going to have those conversations with your project and say, well, we're going to try to get it, but I might put some of those points in the maybe column until the industry is really able to achieve these 2, 4, or 6 total points. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So you're going to hear this a lot, LCA, life cycle assessment, and it is that entire, throughout a product's life cycle, not just, what's it take to produce the material and ship it and install it, but we've got to go further back and then further at the end of its life cycle. So we're going to talk a little bit about LCA today. But Jana, if you could, on this slide and the next one, help high level, just talk a little bit about EPDs, HPDs. They've been around for a while. We have these green building rating systems that are really putting them front and center. Can you help us just understand why these are important, and then we'll go through some terminology.
Yes, definitely. So one of the first reasons is that architects, engineers, owners are all really interested in material optimization. That's really driven through global interest in product transparency. And a lot of that is really coming from what we're starting to learn and know about human health and chronic diseases, and also the impacts that we're having on our environment. So as we're kind of questioning the impacts that we have as people, materials are something that we really have control over. Many of you have probably worked on or been involved in projects that are interiors projects or renovations, and you don't necessarily have control over the entire building, but you do have control over the products that are coming into that space. And so there's really a wider range of project types that can also make an impact by knowing what's in the materials that are coming into the space. Another really important thing about materials is that with the green building movement, we've focused a lot on efficiency, which is great, something that we really need to think about. But with efficiency has come sealing our buildings tighter and tighter. And basically what that means is that we're sealing in any contamination that we bring into the building with us. So that's even more important from a human health perspective, as we have products that may have volatile organic compounds that are off-gassing from them, or other hazardous chemicals in the actual ingredients that are in those products. We're now trapped inside with those different products, or with those different contaminants. And then additionally, with the green building movement, we've downgraded our mechanical systems, again, thinking about efficiency, which is extremely important from the environmental perspective. But this also means that there's less fresh air flushing through our space and moving out some of that contamination. So definitely from a human health side of things, thinking about some of these transparency documents is really important. We're also seeing government purchasing becoming more and more important. And then additionally, the green building and healthy building standards that are voluntary but are really driving the industry forward and encouraging those of us to pick products that have some of these transparency documents available, and becoming more and more with V4, and I think we'll continue to move this way, being really able not just to get a check mark for having certain certifications, but also being able to compare the information that's in these certifications to really pick the best products for our project.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you for that, that high level why it's important. I mean, so many of these green building rating systems, maybe we're making a business case, maybe we're staying competitive, but you know, this is super important to the health, and that's where a big part of the green building movement has moved. Obviously, Jenna, with your company, and Delos and IWBI and the well building standard, we're really focused on health more than ever. So could you just, what's the main difference between EPDs and HPDs? Some acronyms we all need to get familiar with.
Yeah, sure. So an EPD stands for an Environmental Product Declaration. And having an environmental product declaration is really a snapshot of a bigger analysis that's based on a life cycle assessment of your product. So really getting and giving you a sense of the impact on the environment that that product has. And we'll get into a little bit more detail there, but really thinking about a product from as early as its raw ingredients and where those are coming from and what those are, all the way through to what is the end of life of that product. Can it be recycled, or is everything going to landfill? So it's really looking holistically at the impact of the product on the environment. That is different from an HPD, or a health product declaration, which looks a bit more at the ingredients that make up a product, and then also think about any hazards or health concerns that come from those ingredients that are in the product. So this is not looking holistically at the life cycle of that product. It's just looking at what that product is made of and the impact that that could have on wherever this product is going. And that is run by the Health Product Declaration Collaborative. But high level, EPD is holistic. What impact does this product have on the environment? And HPD is a snapshot of what are the ingredients in this product and what negative consequences could they have. Great.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. So here's some acronyms as we go throughout the rest of today's class. LCA, EPD, HPD, and we'll get a little more into GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, and maybe PCR, the product category rule, as we get into some of our specifications. All right, so I sent out a poll. Let me send out one more before we move on. We're going to talk transparency next. We're going to talk about how LEED has really pushed with version 4. So one more poll here. How transparent is your company right now with your materials? Do you have these EPDs in place? Are you really talking about your material ingredients? Or no, you know what, we're not there yet. We've been focused on older versions of LEED and older requirements with our MS-DS sheets and our cut sheets. So let's be honest, open. We realize some of you on the call today are out in front, others just now coming around to it, or hey, you know this is coming, you want to get the information, start acting on it. So thanks for filling out this poll here. All right, so I'm going to walk through for a few minutes about the LEED version 4 material requirements as you're filling out that poll. So the first, MR, Materials and Resources Credit, it's optional, it's a credit, you don't have to do it, but of course the peer pressure is on. We need these points to move to silver or gold on our LEED projects, and we need to be buying better materials, again, for the health of those building occupants coming in. So the first one's called Building Product Disclosure and Optimization, Environmental Product Declarations, 1 to 2 points. Here's the actual language. One of the resources we're going to give all of you is usgbc.org/credits. And that's a good place to go and look at the exact LEED language that you need to be meeting. Later in our questions, we'll go into a little more detail, but in order to earn these 1 or 2 points, to earn the first point, option 1, you have to have at least 20 different permanently installed products from at least 5 different manufacturers. So, you know, some of the LEED credits you've gotten used to over the years, you know, are weighted by cost. And so as we go through this, some of these are no, just get 20 and from 5 different manufacturers. Later on, we'll talk about some by cost. So try to follow along, but you can ask questions as we go. So in order to earn that first point, you need 20 products and EPDs, but from at least 5 different manufacturers. You can't just have one window manufacturer that has all the materials in one window assembly. That's not good enough. We've got to do more. Okay, and this is where we're focused on the EPDs first. We're actually going to upload these to LEED Online to prove this out on our LEED projects to get that 1 point. So that transparency there. In order to get the second point, though, you can see that we have to use products that comply with one of the criteria below for 50% by cost. And so now it's not just have the documentation in place for a lot of the materials that we're buying for this next LEED project. Now it's, do we have the better materials, the healthier materials, those that have a less of an impact here, as you can see on the environment. So does that EPD show that we're meeting any of these requirements here? So those are the 1 or 2 points. Let's go over that again. The first point is more about the MSDS sheets, or in this case, the actual EPDs. Do we have enough of the materials documented? The second part, though, is do we have the better materials? By cost, did we hit this mark? So those are the 1 or 2 points for the first one. Let's close that poll, but any experience maybe, Jana, with this on any LEED projects or well projects, just any experience so far with any of these LEED credits? Let me close that poll.
Yeah, definitely. Just one thing I will chime in. So for option 2, this can be a little bit tricky in that you are comparing your own EPD to the industry standard, so an industry-wide EPD. These are somewhat few and far between at this point in the industry, and so there's actually some other language that makes this a little bit easier, though there is still some work on the manufacturer side. So the alternative strategy here is to allow you to compare your own EPD to an older version of that EPD, basically showing that you're improving the product and improving that impact on the environment between your 2 versions of EPDs or 2 versions of the product. So it's a little bit of an easier way to meet that option 2, but this can be a tricky one and is a great one to get ahead on. We haven't seen as many manufacturers pursue this quite yet, just because it is challenging. But that first option is one that we've seen more and more manufacturers get on board with. More and more lists of products with EPDs, from carpet manufacturers to door hardware manufacturers, that have this information available for their products, which makes it really easy for project teams to see what they can use on the product to help get this credit.
Awesome. No, thanks for pointing that out. Michael, go ahead.
Charlie, one thing just to mention as well, just be careful if you're certain types of typical engineering equipment, mechanical equipment, etc. While EPDs, for some of that, we've seen a little bit of those, they may not be eligible. So you've really got to be careful before you just go all in on this. Make sure that you check that the equipment is actually eligible to be. Just because mechanical equipment is permanently installed does not necessarily mean that it would meet this. There was at one point an exclusion for it. They're loosening those regulations a little bit, but it's still pretty tight for what types of engineering equipment can meet that criteria.
Thanks for that experience. So that's good. So option 1 focused on the EPDs. Again, 20 materials from 5 manufacturers. Option 2, the better materials, or as Janice pointed out, there might be an option where you've just shown improvement of your own products, of your own EPDs. Let's talk about the next credit. Again, we're just trying to go through the LEED language for you to get comfortable with. The next one is materials and resources, building product disclosure and optimization, but now we're going to look at the sourcing of raw materials, 1 to 2 points. Some of this language is going to look familiar as it has built on some of what we've done on previous LEED projects here. So option 1, worth 1 point. You can see this number 20, so 20 materials documented from 5 different manufacturers again, and that's where you as a manufacturer have to work with the contractor on what was specified. Is your material going to be one of those? We're identifying maybe you as a designer, as an architect, you've got to make sure you're specifying that we've got to have at least this much documentation. You can see that in our corporate sustainability report, CSR, another acronym here, we want to make sure that we've used some of the frameworks at the bottom, like the GRI sustainability report. So that's the first point. The next point, though, is where we focus on the extraction. And this one is by cost, so at least 25% of the materials. We take out the labor, take out the equipment, by material cost. Do we have bio-based materials? The wood products, are they FSC? Have we had some refurbished materials? Do they have the recycled content? Again, a lot of that's carried over from LEED version 3 and previous versions of LEED. For the second material credit that's really a game changer in the industry, we're looking at the CSRs, the corporate sustainability reports here, about the extraction reporting, worth 1 point. And then the second point is the actual material, but now by cost. Are we able to use these more eco-friendly materials? Anything to add on this credit, Jen or Michael?
I don't have too much. I would just say that with option 2, this is really a consolidation of where a lot of the materials credits from 2009 or LEED v3 came from. And so this is, even now when I reach out to manufacturers, this tends to be the response. We still have FSC or still have recycled content, and this is where this is all being consolidated now, no longer split up into different credits or parts.
Good point. Yeah, where FSC wood used to be its own LEED credit, now it's rolled in here. We've got to have maybe some recycled, some reused materials, some bio-based products to add up to that 25% by cost, which is more. A lot of you that are working on previous LEED projects, you remember 10% or 20% for that recycled content. Now we're rolling it all together and saying, no, 25% of the materials that we're going to buy for this next LEED project, let's make sure they're eco-friendly. So good stuff.
I would also add there's the same exclusion for MEP products that would apply to this. But again, you need to check on the USGBC's website because they have loosened the criteria on that a little bit.
Okay. So the last credit, just to give you the highlight on the LEED language, is the MR credit for building product disclosure and optimization. You're going to keep seeing that with material ingredients, and this is worth the 1 to 2 points. The first point is the material ingredient reporting. You see it again, 20 different products, 5 different manufacturers, but now we're really going to be pushing harder on the ingredient side. You can see it's the manufacturer's inventory here. They published what's really in these materials. You can see as we go down, you can meet some of the labels, but this is where that acronym HPD comes up, the Health Product Declarations. You can earn some other labels like Cradle to Cradle or Declare, and we'll talk about that in a second. So in order to earn the first point, you either have to have the HPDs, very transparent, and or have earned some of the Cradle to Cradle, Declare, some of the other labels for those materials you're providing. The second point is the material ingredient optimization, and that's where we go to the green screen, to the Cradle to Cradle. We've really gone and pushed further there. This is by cost, 25% by cost, all the materials for the project. Let's go back to the first option here. Jana, can you speak a little bit here about HPDs? Are people doing this? Are they kind of skipping past that a little bit and going to Cradle and Declare? Like, what are you seeing out there? Is it a mix of everything?
Yeah, definitely a mix of everything. I think manufacturers really need to look at what is shown on these different transparency documents. And so I've seen some that a product will look better with a Declare label than with an HPD, or vice versa. And therefore, that's kind of what you choose to go with. And all of these different third-party certifications or labels have a bit different requirements or show somewhat different information. And we could go on and on about that. We'll talk a little bit more about the HPD, which again is that disclosure of the ingredients in your product and also any of the negative impacts that could come with that. Declare is very similar in that it is almost like a nutrition label on your building product, requiring that you list out 100% of the ingredients in the product and also identifying if there's any VOC testing. And then Cradle to Cradle is an even deeper dive in many ways, takes into account more of the life cycle impacts of the product while also considering red lists and the materiality and materials that are going into that product that could have a negative impact. They all also come with different costs and different levels of transparency. And so those would just be two things that I would note to also take into account when looking into them. I will also say, when looking into what to pursue, this is something that is definitely heard in the materials industry, coming from manufacturers and having some confusion about where to start. And there seem to be quite a few labels, even though we are narrowing them down as these building standards continue to align somewhat in what is being recognized. But even going to these web pages of these different, Cradle to Cradle or HPD, there's some quick videos that are really easy to just get a high-level overview of what is covered and what would be required to get this certification, which if you haven't or if you aren't familiar with some of these already, that's a great way just to get a high-level overview beyond what we're going to tell you today to understand what is needed with each of those.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of you on the webinar today, you've got to decide you're going to invest in some of these labels to make sure you're meeting the requirements for future projects, so you're more likely to get specified, so you can meet those requirements when people are asking. But there's several out there, so just make sure you get familiar with the LEED language here, what is accepted under this LEED credit, and then the second point, though, it's more specific on the green screen, the Cradle to Cradle, and remember, all of these are by material cost. And then this third one here pushes on the supply chain optimization. Again, there's a cost to document that. Here's our processes of how we're greening up our supply chain. So just understand you can even go to that extent here as we're documenting our materials. So that's the LEED language. I know there's a few questions coming in. We're going to try to get to those, but we want to do a little bit deeper dive now on EPDs, show some examples, HPDs, and just talk, who are the early adopters. We're going to get to that in just a little bit. So, Jana, can we walk through a little bit here as we look at life cycle analysis? What's some of your early experience with it? I'm sure you're excited as a material specialist to see these green building rating systems really putting this front and center, but let's talk LCA if we could.
Yeah, definitely. So as we mentioned before, EPDs are based largely on a life cycle assessment, and this is really looking at or starting out with a life cycle inventory. So understanding what needs to be collected, what is going into this product, where are all the different areas that this product and materials associated with the product manufacturing with the product, transport of the product, where in all of these different stages is there an impact on the environment. So we've broken down some of these stages here that come from early on when that product is or materials are extracted, so from raw material extraction through transportation and extraction, processing to the site, processing itself, and you're going to end up with a finished product. And then, of course, that finished product is going to be put into use in a building project, and then later in its life will be disposed of or reused, ideally reused. And so there's a couple different ways that we look at a life cycle assessment. And if you break down this list we have here, steps 1 through 4 are cradle to gate. So that's one way to look at a life cycle assessment. It's really taking it from the manufacturer perspective, what you have control over for the most part. So what you have control over as far as what you're extracting on the material side, and then all of the different stages that that product goes through to get it to the market. You can also look at a product if you include all of these steps from cradle to grave, and this also takes into account the use phase of the product. And depending on what the product is, some products may have more of an impact in that use phase than even in the phase before that. And then, of course, one of the things that manufacturers do still have control over, and we've seen more and more with take-back programs and using recycled materials or recyclable materials or even compostable materials, is that end of life of the product. So can we avoid having products that wear down quickly or are used up with one use in a building, and can we reuse those? Can we have furniture that a client loves so much that they take it to a new location, or can be remade into another product? And that's something really on the manufacturer side that's thinking about step 1 and what you're extracting from the raw material side can really influence the end of life. So it's a little bit of an overview on that. And beyond that, we then think of what these impacts are on the environment. So this table is breaking this down into atmosphere, water, the earth, and what you're getting out of an LCA and therefore also an EPD is really seeing the impact in metrics of all of these different steps of the process, and then overall as a product, what is the impact on global warming potential, for example, in equivalent or in CO2 equivalents? What is the ozone depletion potential or the eutrophication potential, really across all of these different categories? And one, this is great, and that's giving you insight into where your product really has the biggest impact, and may even be able to identify areas that are easy to change and reduce that impact. But the other great thing about EPDs that LEED v4 has started to do with that option 2 in comparing your product to industry averages or industry standards or earlier versions of your own product is also really asking project teams not just, do you have an EPD? Did you go through this process and are you transparent about the impact? But also really starting to compare, is this a better product than your other product, or is this a better product than the competitor's product? So this is really giving you insight into that, and I'm really happy to see that LEED v4 is pushing the envelope a bit. I think the industry needs to catch up to that, but it's definitely an opportunity for manufacturers to start getting rewarded for the changes that they've made to improve on this impact to the environment that wasn't necessarily as recognized before. So to go a little bit deeper into EPDs, we've given a little bit of an overview. I will note that EPDs are third-party verified, which is one of the strengths of them. You can definitely do a life cycle analysis on your own or with a consultant that isn't necessarily verified, but EPDs really give you that third-party stamp saying that this is a study or an assessment that has been verified. You can think of it as somewhat like a nutrition label. While it isn't addressing all the ingredients in the product like a nutrition label would, it still is giving you that kind of nutrition label stamp high-level overview of all of the results and all of the conclusions from these deeper assessments that have been done. And so what you're seeing on the right is a great product, an EcoBat product, and right in the middle of the slide almost, you see that green logo that is signifying that you have that EPD. And then towards the right is what the first page of your EPD really looks like, and you can see some background information about the product. And if you continued in that report, you would really see a breakdown not only of the high-level list of materials that are in that product, but all of the different impacts, what they're impacting in the environment, and then also the breakdown of those metrics, the CO2 equivalents and other equivalents that are telling you really about that impact.
Yeah, that's great. And we've got some examples, and at the end of the webinar, we're going to put up some databases, some online resources. So if for some reason your company doesn't have these EPDs in place yet, because they do have to be third-party verified, there's plenty of examples that we're going to give everyone here access to.
Great. So to continue a little bit on EPDs, I will say that EPDs can be for a specific product. So you did see in that LEED credit that there are a couple of different types of EPDs, one of which is an industry-wide EPD, which I would definitely recommend looking into to see if something that you are already making has an industry-wide level EPD. This is not counted for as much of a point as a product-specific EPD, which I'll explain in a moment. But this is an easy way to show that your product is show the impact of your product and show that your product is recognized by one of these certifications without individually doing too much as a manufacturer. So some examples, there's a lot of different steel or studs or wood products that are narrowed down to be North American X, Y, and Z wood, or steel studs from X, Y, and Z locations that really help you to determine the life cycle analysis of those products. But those are put out more generally and can cover your product and give project teams that are using your product credit towards this credit without you having your own life cycle assessment and EPD. However, if you do have your product-specific EPD or a Type 3 EPD, this is giving the project teams that are using that product the most credit for using that. So it is a bit more of a rigorous process in that you need to do this assessment on your product specifically. It does give you really great insight into the impact of your product, and I referenced this briefly before, but really understanding all of the steps of your manufacturing process and transportation process and extraction process can not only be better for the environment, but oftentimes there's some cost savings that you can figure out by doing this analysis and really seeing where the greatest impact is. So I will just note that there's some great examples that I've heard of from other manufacturers with finding that out. But as I mentioned before, EPDs are stating life cycle and are based on these product category rules, which we can go into on the next slide. But this is really helping you to define what product category your product is falling under. So that is typically the first step of the EPD process, doing this search to see what the rules are for your product itself. Continuing in the EPD process, you would conduct your life cycle assessment. So really see the impact again in all of these different categories, verify your LCA with third party. And with that, you can create the EPD on your own and then verify that EPD by a third party to then get that registered and available to share with the industry. And just to give you a sense of timeline, this can take anywhere from 20 to 50 weeks depending on complexity and involvement. There's a lot of life cycle assessment resources that are now publicly available that you can pull from different raw materials and different stages of the process that if your process aligns with those, they really have done some of this research for you. This is really supported by the academia community, so it's definitely something to look for. And then as far as costs for an EPD, there is a one-time plus an annual cost to renew that certification. And then obviously keeping in mind that with that second part of the LEED credit, comparing your older EPDs to your newer EPDs or being able to show a difference between how you're currently making your product and how you're going to make your product moving forward would add to that, but be that way to get the second LEED point.
And Jenna, can you speak, so is it a nonprofit that certifies these EPDs and keeps it up? Where does this annual fee go to?
Yeah, so everything EPD is going to be directly related to, I would highly recommend going to the EPD website just to give yourself a little bit more information about how all of this is happening. But this is third-party verified and on a database, so really easy for you to access at all times.
Gotcha. Thanks. Yeah, and we'll pull up some of those websites in just a little bit here. A few more slides.
Great. So this is basically bringing up if you don't have these rules in place. If you have a specific product type and you're trying to figure out what exactly you should be analyzing in these life cycle assessments, if there isn't a PCR available, we also have some steps here for the typical process that you would go through to get this approved. So first, you obviously want to conduct your search. If there isn't PCR for your product, create a proposal, a draft. This would go through comment, review, and then eventually publication. So really all tying back into that first step of getting into this process of creating an EPD. This just gives you a little bit of that breakdown. All right, great. So that was a little bit of an overview of environmental product declarations. And those really are currently recognized by LEED, as we've seen. Next, I'll talk a little bit about HPDs, which are also recognized by WELL, so something that I also look at all the time on the WELL projects that I am working on. And again, this is supported by the Health Product Declaration Collaborative, and the most recent standard is version 2.1. And I referenced earlier having some great how-to videos on websites, and HPD has a great one that really just shows you the updates to 2.1 and goes into more depth how to read an HPD and also what are the different parts that project teams are going to be looking for. Again, I'm going to give you a high-level overview now, but being conscious of time and our hour that we have, I just want to point that out as another resource to take this a step further. So again, this is generated by a third party and is self-published. And that is one of the things that adds complexity to the HPD. This is something that can be self-declared. You can also have an HPD that is verified that gives you a bit more credibility. But HPD really traditionally has been a tool to demonstrate transparency and to demonstrate what the ingredients are and associated hazards with those ingredients to the industry. And so you'll just notice on this screenshot here on the right, right at the bottom left, you'll see residuals disclosure, which is just one great example of some of the complexities in this form. So you'll see that this is measured to 1,000 parts per million, which is something that LEED recognizes. Some of the WELL features are recognizing product ingredients down to 100 parts per million, and you'll see there's a little ideal next to that. And so the more and more transparency is recognized, but just high level when a project team is looking at this form, I just want to point out that having this form doesn't mean that your product is necessarily 100% good to go, but there is some additional research that you want to be reading some of these details. Is this a product that's measured to 100 parts per million or 1,000 parts per million? Are there more questions that would be asked of the manufacturer? But by pursuing the most ideal of anything, it's helping to minimize those questions and really showcase your product as best in class or as best as you can at this time. And then this shows you a little bit more about what an HPD is looking like. You can see that there's, again, a lot of information here, not only the different ingredients and their respective CAS numbers, but also the percentage of the product that this ingredient is making up. Also, if there's any list translator 1 chemicals in the product, this is also identified here. And then also, what is the use of this product? And as you get into the weeds of these HPDs, there are some ways that if you have one ingredient that's proprietary, there are certain ways to handle that. That would be product specific. But again, as you can see, there's a lot of information here to pull from, which is really helpful for project teams pursuing any of the building standards. But also just a great place to have all of this information.
No, that's great. Thank you, Jenna, for walking through EPDs, HPDs. I mean, there's some companies out in front. Next we're going to talk a little bit about, where do we find this information? How should we be distributing it? We're a manufacturer. Where do we need to put it so that project teams can find it later? And so I'm going to throw up a quick poll as we transition there. But any other comments on, let's talk about HPDs while I throw out this poll. So HPDs, Jen, I think you and I have had this conversation. Some projects are saying, you know what, we want that. That's how we want to earn the LEED points. But others might be shifting more towards cradle to cradle or declare. So can you speak for just a minute about hopefully we can get to the HPD point, or there are some alternatives right now?
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned before, Declare is another alternative to the HPD that is also showing what the ingredients are that are in that product. And Cradle to Cradle can even take it a step further. But like I mentioned, really just seeing what will work best for you. A lot of these are now third-party verified, and even if they're self-reported, you can have them be verified. That gives you that extra bit of credibility and contribution to the building standards. So really thinking about some of the pros and cons, again, considering costs, considering who your market is, if they're predominantly pursuing LEED projects or WELL projects or Living Building Challenge projects, that may also influence which certification you're going through. I think with our headquarters project being case study type project, one of the goals that we've had with it is to see where there is alignment between all three building certifications. And obviously there are more than LEED, LBC, and WELL worldwide. So also considering Green Star and BREEAM and other building certifications across the world. But we're really hoping to be able to share some more of this information with the industry. Just to echo what I mentioned before, it's definitely understood in the material space that there's a lot of information for manufacturers to try to understand and consolidate into what they actually want to pursue and what will bring the most value to their organization. So hopefully pulling some of that together and really being able to show from our project where we've found overlap will be something that is made publicly available and will be helpful to manufacturers in deciding which of these certifications to pursue.
Sure. No, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to close this poll. It's interesting. 56% of the audience puts the information out through their websites, the manufacturer websites, 26 through the sales reps, only 10 to 12% on product databases. In a little while, we're going to show you several databases. You may want to put your materials on there because as a LEED consultant, I can tell you, me and my team, we're going to those databases instead of always having to go to the sales rep or the subcontractor or the manufacturer. So if you can put it out there on those databases, make sure you do that. So only 9 or 10% doing that. There's about 10% other, so if you don't mind, over in the chat box, chat where else you're putting this information. So let me close that poll. Thank you. So let's talk about that next. And we want to talk about who are the early adopters, who are the leaders. So I'm going to go to Jana first, then Michael will come to you. Jana, you've told me about a few companies in particular that you think really have nailed it. There's some on the call here that maybe already have, some that are brand new to this, but who in your opinion has kind of nailed it as an early adopter?
Yeah, definitely. So many good examples. I think Interface is one that we've worked closely with and definitely has a great group of people who know what is going on in the sustainability space, being one of the manufacturers that kind of started this whole movement. But they are very in tune to having some of these EPDs. I think they do EPDs, even if they're not made publicly available, they at least do LCAs on almost all of their products. And they are really using it as a way to improve their own internal operations, not just have these certifications for the industry. However, it's really easy to go to their website or even just Google Interface EPD and find some information about all the EPDs that they have. So I'd say they are a great example of that. Quite a few manufacturers have gotten into the HPD world, largely because you can create an HPD pretty easily, a self-declared one at least, and provide that information for project teams. A lot of the manufacturers listed here. Technion, I also would say, is a great one that's gotten behind the Declare label, and the Living Building Challenge movement, and it's really used declare labels as a way to demonstrate exactly what is in their product. If there's VOC testing for their product, if there's any exceptions or any issues with their product, it's all right there on a label that's really easy to see. But many of these others that we have listed here are also leaders, and just by doing a quick search of some of these, you can see either environmental data sheets or direct links to EPDs, HPDs. ASA Abloy is another great one that just searching ASA Abloy, EPD, or HPD, you can get to a lot of that information that's available for download. I will also say, and I know we're going to get into it in a moment or so won't spoil that, but these databases are really becoming an easier way for project teams to find information rather than going through different websites. But having this information publicly available on a website is also very beneficial to project teams.
Awesome. No, you're right. We want everyone to understand the new LEED version 4 language. We want everyone to make sure, okay, which of these labels are we going to invest in, and then where are we going to put this information? So, Michael, let's shift to you for a minute. Part of your role at Master Spec, I mean, you help with specifications, but you work with both the architects, engineers, the contractors, all the way through the manufacturers. So, what are you seeing when it comes to uptick in LEED version 4, ASHRAE 189, and WELL, and how would you recommend here some manufacturers put this information out?
Thanks, Charlie. I would definitely say, you know, among all the sustainable design systems that are out there, we definitely see more. There's still quite a bit of movement on LEED 2009. Obviously, you can't register a project for that, but you can still build until I believe it's 2020. And then right after that, the biggest sustainable design scheme that we see everyone using is LEED version 4, which means they're definitely looking for EPDs, HPDs, any sort of sustainable design documentation that you can find. As to how to distribute it, well, definitely most of the manufacturers that we've worked with or that engineers and architects work with, you know, they do go to the website and they do look for EPDs and HPDs. You know, one of the cons of that is they've pretty much got to go to every single website for every single product or manufacturer that's out there. That does take time. So anything that they can do, like a database that would have multiple products from multiple manufacturers, is really going to save a lot of time. And as a result, databases that host EPDs and HPDs are definitely becoming something that we're seeing a lot of architects and engineers using. So Pharos was kind of one of the original progenitors of this idea, and since then several other databases have come out. I think probably the biggest one at this point is UL, who actually bought a company called Green Wizard several years ago, and Green Wizard was one of the first people in the industry to realize, hey, there's possibly a need for here to host all of this sustainable design documentation in one place. That business model didn't really work out too well for them, but UL's figured out a way to make it work. I think part of that is because they're the ones, they do a lot of the third-party verification that we're talking about. So they'll put on this database basically any product or material from any manufacturer that they've gone through and generated an EPD or HPD for, or that they've gone ahead and verified, okay, this is a valid EPD or an HPD. So for right now, I think most of what is on UL's database is from UL, but I think they're opening it up to others. ASTM is another. There's not too many on there, but they're another organization that's been involved in this, from day one. One of the cons for this, and we've heard some griping about this, is it's sometimes the information is out of date because it's another place that, as a manufacturer, you've got to put your information. So just be aware that if you're going to get involved in something like this, you have to keep that information up to date.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So
I will just.
Sorry.
I think also just to jump in, I think one of the great transitions that we're starting to see to make this a little bit better, because I know the industry's kind of been like, oh man, one more database. But at least something I'm very involved in mindful materials, and one of the things that we're doing is making sure everything is integrated through APIs. So that's now pulling automatically from the declared database and automatically from other places not necessarily a manufacturer website, but pulling from some of these other databases to consolidate the number of locations where manufacturers have to enter that information. And I know some of these other databases are also doing that, and I think it will really start to drive this process to be simpler on the manufacturer side as far as where that information goes and therefore what information is becoming out of date. So I'm hopeful about this, moving in the right direction.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of movement in that area, especially I would even say within the last year or so. It's really gained a lot of traction. So you're basically, how do you find out whether or not you need to provide this as part of your submittal for a project? Well, there's a couple ways right now that architects and engineers are figuring out during design what products they're going to use. Kind of the new and trendy way right now is as you're putting together your BIM model, you make one of the characteristics or one of the keynotes in there for some sort of sustainable design documentation. This is kind of more on the cutting edge at this point. There's definitely been some issues that we've heard about with this. So typically, you're going to find in the specifications there are going to be requirements for sustainable design documentation, and we'll go over that pretty quick. Basically, there's 3 locations. In Division 1, you're going to find general requirements, and then within your specific specification sections that describe the products and materials that are going to be used within the product, you'll find then in Part 1, general, there's going to be some requirements for what needs to be submitted for those products, and then in Part 2, there will be some very specific requirements for those products. For instance, it might be VOCs or something. So if you're looking for EPDs and HPDs and specifications in Division 1, basically just keep in mind you've got to follow the submittal procedures that are in the project, and these apply to basically any type of submittal. And just a heads up, typically some sort of sustainable design submittal, EPD, HPD, etc., that is going to be in addition to a typical submittal. So it's never going to go ahead and replace it, and it's still subject to all the same rules that are in whatever are out there for the submittals for that project. So then the next thing you've got to figure out is, okay, are they using a sustainable design scheme? And within MasterSpec, we support several design schemes, LEED 2009, version 4, IGCC, ASHRAE 189.1, and Green Globes. So you'll typically find a specification section also in Division 1 that talks about some fairly specific, it talks about the specific rating system, but then some specific requirements that are in there. So if you take a look at the LEED version 4 BD and C specification section in Division 1, it's going to be pretty much high-level requirements that the contractor has to comply with, and if it comes to documentation, they're going to push this back to the distributor or manufacturer. And in Part 1 of this Division 1 section, you're going to see some general requirements that are specific to sustainability, typically administrative or submittal requirements. Like I mentioned before, all your sustainable design is going to be in addition to your typical submittals, etc. If they're going for some extended credit, this is where you're going to find requirements for cost data. So then in Part 2 of that Division 1 section, you'll find some specific materials requirements. This will go to, again, going back to the cost or VOC limits, and these will typically are more of a heads up of what's coming. You'll also see sometimes if it's VOC limits, it'll be within the specific specification section for that product, right next to the product. You'll see, okay, this is your VOC limit, etc. Here's kind of the inventory of everything within the project. So then in Part 3 of that Division 1 section is where we'll go into flushing the building or etc. Also where they'll talk about what happens if the building does not meet the criteria that they're looking for, which is something the manufacturer is never going to really get too involved with, but it's good to know what happens too, because your payment might be tied to that, etc. So if we talk about a specific specification that's looking at a product, and just I didn't mention this earlier, but we're looking at the CSI 3-part specification here. So Part 1 is general. That's going to really talk about your specific submittals here. So in this case, everything that's highlighted in green could be retained by the architect or engineer as a requirement to submit an EPD, HPD, your corporate sustainability reports if they're looking for sourcing of raw materials. And these requirements are going to change a little bit depending on what sustainable design scheme you're looking at. Once you get to part 2, we're looking at specific requirements. And again, I said, in the Division 1, you'll see kind of the overall inventory. Here, for this wire and cable, you're seeing there's a specific criteria for lead content within a wire, which is something that's in a hospital situation. They try to minimize as much of these compounds as they possibly can. Just to give you a heads up, this is kind of more the exception than the rule. And that's something you won't see too often, but it's just there sometimes. And let's go to the next slide, Charlie. And then let's talk about some of the resources we talked about. So ASTM, the Health Product Declaration Collaborative, ISO, and the NSF are some of the big names that are involved in this. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but it's a great place to start. For an EPD, you're probably going to be taking a look at some of the third parties, and these, again, not at all a comprehensive list, but it's a good place to start. It's some of the bigger names that have done some of this work. And then we talked about databases a little bit too. So ASTM has a pretty small one. Mindful Materials actually came out of HKS several years ago. Very, very good resource, as is the Pharos project. And there's a couple others that have been out for quite a while. And that's it on my end.
Yeah, thanks. We've packed in a lot of good information here today, so maybe just a few more minutes. A couple of questions came in, and then we want some closing remarks. So, Jana, international certifications for these materials, labels, anything you're seeing, you're experiencing? I think some on the audience today might have a question, is this more U.S. or can some of these carry overseas? If we have products internationally, what should we be doing there?
Yes, so a lot of these are international certifications or third-party standards. So most places these would apply, and as LEED is pretty worldwide, would be recognized there. And WELL, currently I think there's WELL projects in 28 different countries, so would be recognizing these same requirements. There also are some, not as much on the EPD side, but there are definitely some other transparency certifications, or even more granular, like VOC certifications that are more local based on different countries. LEED does publish some of these international standards as equivalent, and then kind of as you get more into the VOCs, and WELL does as well. So WELL currently accepts any equivalent standard from other countries as long as you get it approved through the International Well Building Institute. So it may just be on a case-by-case basis, but for the most part, these EPDs and HPDs can be used everywhere and are becoming pretty industry standard worldwide. Charlie, Michael, I don't know if you would disagree, but I think that's what I've been seeing in the industry.
Sure.
I can definitely echo that.
One more question, then we'll have some closing remarks. So here we are being told we have to be more transparent as manufacturers. So how do you protect your intellectual property, your trade secrets? Does an EPD disclose that much, or is it more of an HPD on the actual ingredients and makeup? So if we could just speak quickly on how are companies navigating this? Is it we just have to do it, and to stay competitive, we have to put it out there, or can you provide information, say, to a LEED project and not put it on a database? So there's some questions coming in. Jana, any experience with that?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that gets asked a lot. There are some exceptions. I was mentioning with holding some things proprietary in HPDs. Declare has its own proprietary ingredients exception as long as you're falling below a certain percentage or ingredient number of what you're withholding. There really is a big push for transparency and just understanding what is in a product to be able to provide that information to product teams or occupants. So I think a lot of the building standards and certifications really push for that. I will say that is one of the differences between cradle to cradle and full disclosure on an HPD or a declare label. Cradle to cradle, you are under NDA, and so don't necessarily have to publicly disclose all of your ingredients to get the certification. That is typically the more expensive certification, just because it's a bit more in-depth than an HPD or a declare label. But it's harder if you do want to withhold the majority of your product and hold that IP to get a declare label, just because you are limited in, or you're required to disclose a certain amount. And depending on what you're filling out in the HPD and what you're disclosing, you will notice that in LEED and in WELL, there are some restrictions, actually not in WELL right now, but in LEED, restrictions around the level of disclosure and what you need for an HPD to count. But that's some high-level insight in there. But that is a good point to bring up, that is one of the major differences between cradle to cradle and HPD or declare, is that due to that arrangement and NDA, you are able to hold more proprietary.
Thanks for answering that. Well, let's just have some closing remarks, and we'll get out of here. So, Jana, what are you excited about? What do you? Any final thoughts here?
Yeah, well, I'm just really excited. I've been getting really involved in mindful materials, which has been just a great way to interact regularly with a lot of other materials specialists and the materials industry. And I really think this industry is quickly moving in the right direction to narrow down what we're asking manufacturers for and making this process simpler. I also think with a lot of my work on WELL, we've really brought the occupant into the conversation. And as people learn more about hazardous ingredients or what may be off-gassing from their products, it's not just the building standards that are driving this interest in healthy materials, but also the residential market and people in general who are just learning about this. One of the most frustrating questions that I get when I speak on panels outside of the building space is just that, this is great, let's incorporate this into office spaces and the commercial sector, but how do we also bring this home every day? And we need more simplified databases that any consumer can go to and understand. And I think we're moving in that direction. So having HPDs and EPDs really contributes to that. So overall, positive. We're moving in the right direction from my perspective.
No, we surely are. Michael, any closing remarks?
Well, it's interesting to see how this movement has accelerated over the past couple of years. I remember when HPDs and EPDs first came out, and it was kind of a very few and far between, and now it's definitely getting to the point where there's some fairly critical mass behind it. But in talking with architects and engineers all the time, it's definitely one of those things where still not quite at the point where it's they're finding everything that they need. So it really is becoming almost a mandatory thing at this point. But it's interesting, even though it's almost mandatory, not everyone has really jumped on that train at this point. So it's still it's one of those things where if you're not really on that train, I wouldn't say the train has necessarily left the station, but it's pretty close to getting to the point where, it's going to leave that station, and if you're not on it with this type of documentation, it's going to be very difficult to get a lot of the bigger high-profile projects and get your materials and products included within those. And to echo what Jana says, it's very interesting to see how people who are involved in this are going a step further and even taking it home. In fact, one of the consultants I work with quite a bit, he's using basically everything that he's working with us on to help build his passive house. So you're working with people now who are basically living and breathing exactly what they're saying. So you have to be willing to step up to the plate at that point.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I would just add, our goal here was to show you, okay, especially LEED version 4. Here's the new language. Here's the terms you need to get familiar with. Maybe your company's out in front, but you within your company got to get more familiar with how to even talk about it. Put your information out on databases, and we've brought you some subject matter experts today. So hopefully you can continue the conversation back at your companies, and now you feel more confident with these new requirements, EPDs, HPDs.